Welcome to our show today. My name is Craig Rivera, and I have the honor of working with the Cultural Services Department and particularly with the KiMo Theatre. Today, we are going to take a historical look at the KiMo Theatre's history, and I have an awesome guest with me today. Mary McKinney, welcome to our show today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mary, I am so delighted to have you because you have information that is really relevant to the KiMo Theatre, and that is you were an employee.
Yes.
What years were you an employee at the KiMo Theatre?
I started in 1941, and I finished in 1944.
Wow. You were there in the golden age of cinema
Yes.
at the KiMo Theatre.
Yes.
But what was your role at the KiMo Theatre?
Well, it depended whether they needed someone in the box office or someone to sell candy.
So you had a whole variety.
But I did all of them.
Did you work specifically at the KiMo Theatre?
No, I traveled a lot. The only two theaters I didn't work at was the Chief and the Sunshine, and Mr. Barnett had two cashiers that he wouldn't trade.
At the KiMo Theatre, what other theaters was the KiMo associated with?
Well, there was the Old Pastime, which they named the Chief, and then we had the Rio, which was to the east of Sunshine, and across the street was the Mission Theater, and that was our theaters.
Wow. So let me ask you, what was the difference between the KiMo and let's just say the Mission? Was the KiMo playing like the first-rate movies? And maybe
KiMo and Sunshine both played the first-rate movies, and the Chief always got the seconds. The Rio played the B movies.
So let's
like
talk about
Roy Rogers and
Roy Rogers
and Gene Autry and those. The Mission mainly played the Spanish.
What's so interesting is that I've had so many people come into the KiMo Theatre talking about that they'd spend their Saturday afternoons going from theater to theater to theater. But right now, I think you've named in the downtown core, there were at least 5 theaters that existed. Since we're talking about an era in how everything has become so expensive, in 1941, if I was to go to the KiMo Theatre to see that first-run movie, how much would it cost me to walk through the doors?
25 cents, I think, in the afternoon and 40 cents at night.
Wow. Considering that we spent a lot more than that. Okay, so that our viewers get some idea. If you go to a movie theater today, I might spend up to $5 to $7 for a box of popcorn. How much was a box of popcorn back then?
5 cents.
Isn't that amazing how much it's changed? I know that you actually had, you eventually got married to one of the managers at the KiMo. I'm lucky because I'm one of several managers that I was a manager at the KiMo Theatre. But when you were at the KiMo, tell me about the managers. Who were the managers that you worked under?
Well, Harry Hickox, if I can remember at my age, was manager of the KiMo, and he went out to Hollywood. He wound up in the movie Music Man. He's the one that gave, I can't think of his name right now, but he sold the Ironworks, and he's the one that gave the lead the bad time. But when he left, Bud took over.
And Bud is who?
And Bud is my brother-in-law. And I had a teenage crush on him, as every other girl did. But he was wonderful. He loved the theater.
And his name was Bud McKinney?
Well, his birth name was Robert Stanley. And he married a cashier from the Chief Theater.
Wow.
It seems to run in the family.
Okay, so we've got Bud, and then who next?
And then Bud left, and my husband took over.
And your husband is who?
And my husband was T. William Bill McKinney.
Wow. And what years was Bill the manager of the KiMo?
From about 43 to about 46, 47.
That was a great era at the KiMo
Yes,
Theatre.
it was a wonderful era.
I'm really curious to know that when you were working at the KiMo, how many people worked in the KiMo? What were the various functions? Was it a streamlined operation, or was there a lot of
Well, for
activity?
that age, for that time, it was. There was a telephone operator and a secretary. I can't remember who answered the phone, but Dixie Lee Schaefer was the secretary. And George Tucker, who came from Dallas, Texas, was the city manager for all the theaters and for the KiMo. I got robbed one time.
Did you really? Tell us.
He had asked me to work overtime. I had just gotten out of one box office, and it was at the Mission. And so when I got ready to check in, this man grabbed my money bag, and knowing me, I chased him down the alley, and behind me was one of the police chiefs giving me a hard time.
Are you serious? How interesting
Yeah.
is that? I know that the KiMo was really a special building, and to today I have so many guests who walk into the KiMo who just say it just had such a strong meaning. One of the things that seems to come up a lot is the question about the skulls and the red eyes. And so did you ever have anybody comment or any kids ever talk to you about that?
No, I think we all seem to take it for granted because we lived with the culture of the Indians.
That's awesome.
And
well, my next question for you is that, you know, the KiMo Theatre was built, would never have happened without the vision of Maria and Oreste McKinney. So I'm curious to know, did you ever have an opportunity to work with any of the McKinney family?
Mr. McKinney came at the KiMo every day to see how things were running. And every once in a while, they would call and say, will you come in and answer the phones? As if I didn't have enough to do. And another little story, I was all by myself in the office, and being in a theater all by yourself is kind of eerie. And it had been about an hour or so, and I heard someone coming up the steps. And I yelled, who goes there, friend or foe? And it was Mr. McKinney.
What was he like? I kind of see him as a very elegant man.
He was.
He was. But how did he react to the friend or foe?
He laughed.
Did he really? So, you know, I think the neat thing about the downtown, when anybody who grew up in a downtown, there were these great hangouts where high schoolers would go. The KiMo was linked to one of those places. It was called the Kiva Low. Can you build a picture for our viewers? What was the Kiva Low like after school?
Well, it was in the Highland Drugstore, which was across the street from Albuquerque High. And the kids particularly that lived on the west side of the city, would stop and get a Coke. And that was kind of a hangout. And if we'd say, oh, well, we'll see you at the Low, or we'll see you at the High, which they knew was the Highland Drugstore. And growing up in Albuquerque, and I miss it terribly, you could walk down the street and within 3 or 4 steps see someone you knew. And it was really a very small town, but a very close-knit town.
I think that's what I've heard time and time again, is that the downtown was the place.
Well, my graduating class of 41 celebrated its 70th year from graduating from Albuquerque High School last weekend. And there was about 10 or 12 of us, and it was so wonderful to see old friends and to have a 70th anniversary.
That is awesome.
Yes.
You mentioned something that was a fun activity at the KiMo Theatre on Wednesday nights. What was it that took place back in 41, 42, and 43 that was so special?
Bank night.
Bank night? What did that mean?
Well, they had it at the KiMo and they had it at Sunshine, and I think the chief had it. They put a certain amount of money away, and then you would sign up, and they would draw your name, and you might win $50 or $25. In those days, that was a lot of money.
A lot of money. Talking about a lot of money, I have a question for you. Again, being an employee, this is to give our viewers a contrast of wages in 1941 versus today. What did a cashier make at the KiMo Theatre back
I
in
never
41?
took home more than $15. The most I ever took home was $20, and I think that was because I had worked so much overtime.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
And how many hours a week would you work? I mean, 40?
Well, normally you work 4 hours in the box office, but there would be days like Saturday, I would open the box office at 8:30 because we had a kids show at the KiMo. I would close the box office at about 10:30, quarter to 11, go next door to the Low and have a hamburger and a Coke, get back in the box office to open it for the matinee, get out of the box office about 5:30 or so, go back and have another hamburger or go across the street to the Coney Island and have a hot dog, get back in the box office at 6 o'clock and work until 9:30 and close the box office and climb back in at 10:30 to sell tickets for the midnight show. So some days I worked 12 hours.
Wow. But it had to be fun. I mean, you're seeing everybody in town walking through the doors. Okay, you made reference to Saturday mornings. I have this great photo of the KiMo Theatre, what looks like it would have been a Saturday morning, where there are at least 100 to 200 bicycles sitting out in front of what was Saturday morning like at the KiMo?
Well, because it was a kid show, the big brothers and sisters would take the little ones to the show. And of course they rode their bikes and what have you. And sometimes the parents would pick the little ones up and the kids would stay and go stand in line and pay for a ticket and go back in for the matinee.
Wow. How much was it for me to go if I was a child?
10 cents.
10 cents. Isn't that amazing? I think one of the comments that I've heard, this is multiple times, where when kids would be in downtown, I mean, they would spend like 10 cents at one theater and then they go to a nickel to another theater. I guess apparently there were different theaters and different prices in the downtown core.
Well, like the Rio and the Mission were
slightly less.
way down. They were about third or fourth on the list. Blanche ran the chief and did the hiring, and she ran a pretty tight ship.
What was Blanche's last name?
Hatton.
Blanche Hatton.
Yeah, she was a lovely lady, very strict and what have you. The only time I ever saw her let down her guard, I took my children one time. She was substituting for Irving Foy at the Sunshine, and they had a kids show on. And so I took my 3 older boys, and most of the seats were gone.
Wow.
So she took Pat and she set him in the aisle. And she told one of the ushers, she said, "Now you be sure these boys get candy all the way through." Bill and I couldn't get that. It shocked us, so we didn't do anything after that.
I can only imagine.
But no, every day you could set your watch. Mr. Tucker would come out of the KiMo. He'd go across the street to the chief. He'd pick up Blanche. They'd go to the Sunshine. They'd pick up Scotty.
And what was Scotty's last name?
Scott.
Scott, okay.
And then they would go next door and pick up Ray Hazlett. And then they would head for the Liberty Cafe, which was...
And where was the Liberty at?
It was between 1st and 2nd on the south side of Central.
I wish I could have been there to just gone to the Liberty to see all those people.
It was fun. The one that two that I really liked was Scotty, and of course Irving Foy.
And who was Irving?
Irving Foy was one of the sons of Eddie Foy, the song and dance man, and he was one of the little Foys.
Wow.
And we have a picture of him talking to Bill.
So since we're talking about celebrities, name some celebrities that you had the opportunity to meet while you were working at the KiMo.
John Carroll.
Wow.
Peter Lind Hayes. And as I say, Ernie Pyle, that was the biggest thrill of all. He came in with Mr. Mount, who was a contractor here in Albuquerque, and they were very close friends. And he came up to I was working the candy case that night, and he says, "Oh, I've got to buy a candy bar." So I said, "Which one would you like, sir?" And he gave me a 25-cent tip.
Wow, that was a lot of money back then.
But he was so nice.
At the KiMo, I can tell by the photos that the KiMo actually had tenant businesses that worked out of the building up on the second, third floor. Do you remember any of those tenant businesses?
The only one I remember is KGGM Radio was above the KiMo.
And for our listeners and our viewers, KGGM eventually becomes one of the top 3 television stations here locally.
Yes.
Eventually, but KGGM had some of its original starts out of the KiMo Theatre.
Right.
Isn't that amazing? Was there a lot of action people walking up and down the steps all day long at the KiMo?
Well, I sat in a little box, so I couldn't see much of what was going on because the side of the KiMo was here and the staircase was here, and so there was really no view. But it was run by the Heben Streets, and they did a beautiful job.
I wonder, do you at all recall what the programming was out of KGGM back in the 40s, early 40s?
Of course, soap operas, and they were affiliated with CBS. I don't think completely at that time. But, you know, I laid awake last night trying to think of different things, and that was one that I thought, and I was trying to remember where KOB was located.
You know, the interesting thing is that you brought up the soap operas, again, for a younger viewer who might be watching this program, is that we're talking before television.
Yes.
And this was a time when it was radio, and
Right.
we listened to our radio for news, and we listened to it for our entertainment, much like we would watching television. So soap opera, I hadn't thought about the fact that radio in the 40s was where we'd be entertained by something like that.
I don't know which station ran it, whether it was KOB or KGGM, but every week you listened to Fred Waring's program.
Wow. So I'm going to ask you, what was downtown Albuquerque like to you as a young lady? I mean, paint a picture of it for our viewers.
Well, it was 5 blocks, and we had the men's hat shop run by Carl Dunlap. We had McClellan's on the corner of 4th and Central across the street from Wohlers. Kissler Collister, Bartley Shop. The Matussi's had Paris Shoe Store.
Wow.
Stromberg's on the corner. And the biggest building, of course, was the First National Bank. And Albuquerque National Bank was 1 street west of the railroad tracks. And it was wonderful. Was
there a lot of activity? I mean, literally, was it, what was it like to go on a Saturday afternoon to downtown Albuquerque? Was it?
Well, everybody, of course, in those days, things were so different. Saturday was shopping day because we had a lot of farming north and south of Albuquerque. And people would come in from out of town to do their shopping, too. So you would see a multitude of different types of people and people you didn't know. But everybody was happy, and it really was a joy.
I think you and I spoke about this on the phone yesterday. I said, I'm lucky because I grew up in a smaller community where there was a downtown. And there's an excitement, and
Yes.
I don't know if, there is a renaissance taking place right now at the KiMo in downtown, and more people are coming in. But, you know, to have lived there before there were malls and before we had so much growth out east and west, people would focus into the downtown core for shopping, as you mentioned. I mean, when you think about some of those businesses, I mean, where would you as a young lady like to go in the downtown core? What were some of your favorite businesses to visit?
Kistler Collister, Bartley Shop, of course, Paris Shoe Store. I love shoes.
Oh.
And, McClellan's, Woolworths. My first job that I had, because I wanted to earn money for my Christmas or spring prom or something, was at Montgomery Ward's. Wow. And it was fun because you got to meet parents too that you didn't see too often. They'd be with your friends, and you'd finally meet some of them that you hadn't met. It was so different from what I had lived with in California that it was awesome to me.
Mary, I just realized that you were working at the KiMo Theatre right at the beginning of World War II. And I know that you have a photo in your possession of a war bond drive that was taking place outside of the KiMo Theatre. Can you give our viewers some insights on being a young lady right at the beginning of this great war? And I know that this was an era before there was television. We received our news through newspaper and also through radio, but also we received some of our news through some of the newsreels. Did we play newsreels at the KiMo Theatre?
Oh, yes. As I said, I don't know whether they had Paramount or what. I was trying to think. Paramount, RKO, and I think Columbia had newsreels. I can't remember all of that, but it came over the radio, and we were all shocked because our boys from the National Guard had been sent to the Philippines, and they were kids we'd grown up with, and it was heartbreaking because we didn't know what was going to happen. And then all of a sudden we have this influx of people from all over the United States come in to it was Sandia Base and then became Kirtland. And it was interesting meeting them. Like Jimmy Stewart was stationed at Sandia for a while. Wow. And you seldom saw him on the street. He kept very much to himself and businesslike. They made a film out there called The Bombardier with Eddie Albertson. Yes. And that...
Did that play the KiMo? Do you know?
No, I think Mr. Barnett made them do it at the Sunshine. He kind of had a stiff fist. He was a wonderful little man, though. I just thought the world of him.
Well, let me ask you, can you recollect any movies that really brought in groves and groves of people to the KiMo?
Not at the, well, I can't remember the KiMo. I do remember the Sunshine because it was such a funny thing to happen in July. Mr. Barnett somehow got a copy of Miracle on 34th Street. And as I said, I think it was in the last of June or the 1st of July. And we all came out of the theater singing Jingle Bells. And I remember that so vividly because there was all these different people jingle belling all the way down the street. Yeah. But the KiMo would have celebrities like John Carroll came in, Peter Lind Hayes, Kirk Douglas, and the employees, they always, after the box office and everything closed, they would have kind of a little program, but only the employees were allowed to attend. So it was kind of kind of nice.
How interesting. You know, the KiMo Theatre not only played movies, but we had live performances at the KiMo during the 40s. I'm curious to know, did you ever get to go to any of those?
I was in one.
Tell me.
The Junior League of Albuquerque always put on a stage show every year. And one year, I don't know who it was, said, look, he said, that's all you've done is dance and sing. You should, so I did, and that was the only time I performed on the KiMo.
Now, I heard that you also got to see Sally Rand performing in conservative Albuquerque in 1942.
There was no restrictions on going to see Sally Rand.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it was, considering that the censorship today.
But, you know, it's so cool, though. You got to see her live.
Yes.
I want you to sum it up for us. What did it mean to you to work at the KiMo Theatre, and what does it mean to you today to still be, you know, part of KiMo history?
Beautiful memories. Seeing people come up to the box office, seeing friends come home from the service, and knowing that they were all right and they were going to be home for good. And the main time was when our prisoners of war came home. That was, you could just feel something in the city that we had never had before. They were home safe. Some of them, of course, weren't in good physical or mental condition, but they were home.
Right.
And I think that was about the best time that I remember, was the end of the war.
That had to have been a glorious time to have been in Albuquerque and to have been, I mean, still working in the downtown when the downtown core was really striving, and then to be at the KiMo Theatre as, you know, even today, the KiMo Theatre, there is no other theater like it in the world, and I'm really proud to be affiliated with that building. I've had the honor of sitting up in the balcony with some very popular people who would look out into our proscenium and look up and just say, I've never seen a building like this. Well, thank you for joining us.
Well,
Mary,
it's been my
thank
pleasure.
You.
I feel honored.
I'm
Thank you
so honored to
much.
have you, and we want you back, and we want you at the KiMo Theatre.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. For information on the KiMo Theatre, make sure that you log on to KiMoABQ.org, or just come to the KiMo Theatre. We're located at 423 Central Northwest. Our doors are always open unless we have a show, and then we'd love to be able to get you inside of our house. So make sure that you come and visit us. The KiMo Theatre. It's a link to our past and a legacy for our future. We're doing what we did in 1927. We're doing it today. Folks, come to the KiMo Theatre. Have a great day. Thank you.